Thank you all for coming out today. Very excited to give this talk. My name is Keelan Smithers. I am a data product manager at the NBA, data product manager of analytics engineering. I know it's a lot of buzzwords in one. The NBA likes to just throw as many words as they can in when they don't really know what you do. But basically my role boils down to managing kind of like our DBT code base, our set of DBT code bases now, and teaching the practice of analytics engineering at the NBA. We'll get into some of the context of the way the data team here is set up, but a lot of it is involved in sort of teaching as much as engineering and designing myself. So today I'm going to talk all about how the NBA has been reworking its analytics machine over the last 20 months. This is not a story where like everything was bad and then a person and a tool came in and now everything is good. This is definitely a check-in on the process. There's a lot left to be done. But I want to focus in and get across how much, at the NBA at least, this was entirely a focus on the people and the culture and the process, more than it was about any sort of tool or data modeling design or technical solution. And that the DBT and the practice of analytics engineering was a great sort of reduction in friction to get people to do work in the way that was more collaborative, but entirely this was focused on just like working through the way people worked at the NBA. So this was on my first day on my onboarding doc. This was slide 4, my #1 project. If I rolled out the script, you can see that basically everything that I was focused on in my projects for the first year was about DBT. I show this mainly to illustrate that there was already buy-in from the NBA, at least at a leadership level, that the status quo wasn't quite right and that they wanted a tool like DBT and they wanted the practice of analytics engineering to be kind of brought in more. That being said, this does not capture the fact that the people that actually were doing the data work had no idea what DBT was, had no idea what this framework was, and so those were the people that we were actually going to be talking about from here. A bit of kind of background context about the NBA's data. I find it funny, the repeated experience of when I tell people I work in analytics at the NBA, I have to disappoint them and explain that I don't actually work on like analytics like is LeBron good at basketball. It's much more of the how do fans interact with the product, right? How do fans go to games, buy merch, watch League Pass, all of that stuff, to kind of understand the personas of the different ways people like basketball, like the NBA, and ideally turn that into a more personalized experience. In terms of our sort of org structure across the people that did data, there's going to be a bit of like an Instagram versus reality section here. This was the intended sort of structure, this hub and spoke idea. DSA in the middle standing for Data Strategy and Analytics. That's the department that I sit in. And the idea being, a lot of these teams would kind of submit needs as they were working. We would then pull those together in sort of a design structure, pass them down to the data engineering team who was really building the platform. They were the ones really putting everything into production. And then these analyst groups were kind of just leveraging that. We also had this sort of heavy reliance on an external consulting group that did a lot of kind of ad hoc transformations for some of those groups. Again, if I reshaped it to the way things actually worked, it was a messy matrix of lines of communication much more based on who you trusted or who you had a good relationship with, who you had gotten something out of in the past. This led to a lot of duplicative work, and there was even groups that didn't talk to anyone really. On top of that, what our architecture really ideally looked like was this sort of medallion architecture. At the time, we were in Databricks, and the classic sort of building value accrual through the system. This sandbox DB was this sort of like pressure release valve, right? If data engineering is the only team that can put stuff into production, analysts need a place that they can prototype things and build something with the intent that they're going to push it upstream, put it into production. If I reshape this one to sort of like where the value actually was accrued and where the work was actually done, this is the reality, right? The start of season is coming up. I don't have time to explain to this data engineer why my SQL query looks this weird, and eventually it just becomes the production SQL query. This happens over and over and over again to the point that at this point when I'm referencing this time period, about 90% of our BI BI dashboards were based almost entirely on sandbox objects. It had become kind of like the de facto prod. Stop me if you've seen a slide like this at this conference so far. I think we don't need to go through all of the different problems that this kind of practice sets up. One just quote that I thought was a good way to kind of capture the experience was, we had something go wrong in an important sandbox pipeline, and someone described it as a cave diving expedition to go figure out what went wrong in the like 17 staged or like stacked SQL queries. This was the experience when I got there, and one that we wanted to change, but we had to think about how we were going to do that. I've said the practice of analytics engineering a lot today. I think this quote from Gwen Windflower in the How We Structure Our DBT Projects is a really dense capturing of what it means, what this practice of analytics engineering is all about. And really what it speaks to is the people doing the work, right? Collaboration being the most important thing, and leverage. I often talk about how, and actually there's been some talks this week about, people are going to find a way to get their work done. And whether they do it the right way or not is really a question of whether you've lowered the threshold for doing it the right way to be the same as getting it done in the first place, right? So analytics engineering to me is finding those ways to make it as easy to work together and do it the right way as to just start from scratch and get it done yourself. The rest of the time we talk today is going to be kind of oriented around this growth curve. This is the PRs opened and closed, as well as the new committers to the project over the last 20 months. These are kind of the metrics I chose. They kind of capture some amount of like velocity and also like potential energy. And so we'll kind of like talk through those as we go and orient around a little bit of like the season schedule as well. I'm breaking these into sort of 3 chapters to talk through: the setup, the scale up, and the keep it up. I talk about this a little bit like DBT and analytics engineering as a startup inside the NBA. Each of these required like a different mindset, and that mindset shift was very aligned with how people talk about when it's time to like really think about the product versus just grow at all costs versus start to shore up how you actually built it in the first place. So talking through the setup. Not a lot got done during this time. This was my first 5 months at the MBA, and I would have loved, obviously, if after this 5 months I could say that there was 20 people working in DBT and committing code. The reality was I didn't know anything about the data and the way people did data at the MBA and had to learn a lot of that. On top of that, as I mentioned before, the people that we really wanted to start using this tool and using this framework were those SQL-capable analysts and those external consultants who were already on this like hamster wheel of, I don't have time to like learn a new thing right now. I'm just trying to get this report out the door, right? And so these sort of months during the season, even if I was trying to show off like what DBT can do and all that stuff, there were just people that didn't have the time to learn it, and I didn't really have the context to know exactly what the right places were to get started. That being said, we did get a lot of cool stuff done. I mean, this was a time where I was able to set up the foundation really well. One of the biggest ones was the DBT guide that we wrote. I did have a little break in the middle to go get married and have my honeymoon, so that stalled things a little as well. But by the end of May, we had our first full-time analytics engineer besides me, and our first load-bearing model in prod. Also, I know these are really small text over here. It's not really intended to be like talk about everything on these slides, but if you see something there that I don't touch on, feel free to ask me about it after the talk or at the end of this talk, anything like that. So during that DBT guide, like I mentioned, this was very much inspired by GitLab's DBT guide, if anyone has seen that. I really loved this idea of just having this living document that kind of captured the way we do work. These were the principles of DBT development. And you'd see the last 3 and say that's stolen straight out of DBT Lab's handbook. And you're right. That's, they've earned a lot of the opinions that they have from doing things certain ways and figuring out what they want to do right. The top one, though, I kind of introduced from a previous company, this clarify intent. This was one of the most important things I think we set up in the first few months and kind of repeatedly hammered over everyone's head. The idea here is clarifying intent has this sort of prerequisite of being intentional. That wasn't always a guarantee every time a stakeholder would submit a query or a question or a ticket, why we were doing it. On top of that, why is this SQL query have this weird where clause in it that no one really understands and no one wrote down what it was for? Clarify intent meant to make sure that that stuff was written down and was very much what you led with. On top of that, it was sort of a call to action, especially as we get into PR reviews and other people seeing your code, that if you see that someone hasn't clarified intent, that is your responsibility to ask for, right? This became something that just like became part of the vernacular and is like laced throughout all of the PR reviews from the last year. One of the things I mentioned was that first load-bearing model. This was fact live game stream starts. We have this sort of big viewership data set that has everything of our league pass data, our game video on demand content, and even just like stories on the app. The product analytics team is sort of inundated during the season with questions about like how many people are watching these games, who's watching what, and for a long time handled that with slices of ad hoc SQL queries. And as we approached the playoffs, they were like, this is untenable, we won't be able to do this. And I saw this as this opportunity to jump at something we could scope down. As I said, we weren't going to capture everything that you could do with stories and VOD games. We made sure to like kind of focus and simplify the process. But also leave some breadcrumbs. And I bring this up kind of as an artifact. This is the first 20 lines of what is probably more like a 400-line model. But it's these sort of practices of acknowledging that I've made a few trade-offs, and that if I were to come back to this, someone else might be the unlucky soul to actually have to expand on this model. But at least it's there as an acknowledgement. This one doesn't have the words to do in it, but littered throughout our code base, you'll find like to do as this sort of like illustration of this practice, which actually comes with a lot of usefulness when you can like search your code base for anywhere to do shows up and do your spring cleaning at times. We'll come back to that one later and talk about that unlucky soul possibly if we have time. Results from this section, like I said, not a ton got done in terms of like load-bearing value. We did have the International League Pass reporting up for the playoffs, and that was super exciting. A lot of the value of this time was in the sort of increased potential energy, increased sort of excitement about collaboration, about this practice as we were heading into the summer. And then I think one more sort of technical specific was when we built that fact live game stream starts, we of course put uniqueness tests, accepted values tests on the subscription and viewership data and caught some data quality issues that had never been found before, right? And that was, I think, a paradigm shift where it was a production job that failed loudly, and that I was celebrating it in Slack and saying, like, this is a great sign. And everyone's like, but it failed. And it was sort of pointing out that, like, that is a good sign. That is a good thing when we want to build patterns that catch that sort of thing. Reflections from this time, I mentioned I wrote a lot. That DBT guide was definitely, I would love if it was like a one-shot of, this is how you do DBT at the NBA. Realistically, there was so much that I had to learn and do to learn. And I would say that anyone who's getting started with a DBT guide or like a perfect folder structure, naming convention, anything like that, just like do your best, acknowledge the trade-offs out loud or ideally written down, and expect to come back to them a lot. We've revisited that DBT guide and like the principles of DBT development and the folder structure, the naming conventions, multiple times as we kind of uncovered more sort of unique things about the NBA that maybe don't fit perfectly into how we structure our DBT projects. Accruing gravity, I mentioned the idea of DBT and analytics engineering as like a startup. If anyone's ever seen one of those like product market fit surveys that's like how disappointed would you be if you didn't have this product anymore, start with the people that would say very disappointed, right? Start with, in something like this, as I was evangelizing this and trying to teach people, I realized quickly like the people who got it were the people that I wanted to invest a lot of energy in and completely leave the other people to the side, not even try to convince them for now, so that we could start building some kind of gravity, start building some kind of momentum. And we saw over the course of the next year, people see, oh, that seems cool. They're doing a lot of good work in that tool. Like, I want in now. And then write everything down. I would say this takes a lot of discipline, but I promise you will not remember why you were doing something or what you were thinking like 3 months later. There's a lot of comments in PR reviews that are just to me from PRs I put up that are useful still for me to come back to. I have this funny sort of experience. I'm known at the NBA as the person who's been like raging against Azure DevOps for their pull request character limit. Because I just wanted to sort of set the standard of like how much you can explain what you're thinking about and why. And they only allow for 4,000 characters, which means like I always hit that. And I keep coming back to this same forum thread and then being like, hit it again, ever gonna change this? But it was sort of like, trying to exemplify the practice of just being really intentional and really clear with what you're doing and why. So moving on to the scale up, I would say for this section, the major context is that we were going through this sort of snowflake migration. Data engineering was moving our silver and gold layer tables to Snowflake as like a place where it was going to be more of like our analytics warehouse. This was a big opportunity for us because all that Sandbox DB stuff was built off of those silver and gold layer tables, and you're damn sure we weren't going to bring those in like one-to-one into Snowflake. This was like our chance to grab those things and try to refactor them, but at least put them with some better guardrails around them. It was also a challenge though, right? This migration came with scale really quickly. There was a lot to do over the summer. One thing about the NBA is like the finals happens and we're all kind of actually chilling. We don't have a lot of work to do. And then everyone goes on vacation, and then everyone realizes when they get back, we're 3 months away from the start of season, and it's time to do everything better. And we just have all these huge projects that happen over the summer. So this year, it was that migration. But that challenge was that there were all these expected outputs already, right? All these things had already been built in Sandbox DB, like plugged into BI tools. If we were going to migrate it, it wasn't very likely that we were going to also like refactor them into some beautiful dimensional model and reshape the way people did BI. Like we were going to have to build these, as at least at the end product stage, exactly how they were, and maybe try and improve the way they were built underneath that. One fun thing about this migration, show of hands, how many people have been through a data migration? I'd be shocked if anyone didn't put their hand up. If you have, you probably recognize that top right box there. It's not something that's meant to be readable, but it is one of those cells in the big Excel sheet of like, there's 70 dashboards, and here's all the tables that dashboard is built off of, and we need to migrate these one at a time, and all this sort of like, you have the status bar and who's working on it and all this stuff. Immediately, that document is overwhelming, even though it's not enough information, right? Like it's static, it's one layer deep, and there's a lot more to each of those things, and yet it's really hard to engage with. Very quickly, I took one of those cells and just threw it all into dbt, put refs where there were froms and joins and whatnot, and visualized it. Did this in 20 minutes. It took me longer to get access to the SQL queries in Sandbox for this, but it resonated with people really quickly. And especially because we had so much to migrate, we were able to open up like one branch for each dashboard or sort of slice of the DAG, and then merge branches together before we were even doing any work, before we were even like trying to run it or refactor it, just to identify these like hot spots where a certain node was used in like 5 dashboards, but it wasn't in the final, BI layer. It was like upstream to know like what we're going to need to work on first. This was really effective like use of dbt that isn't the way you use dbt, but it was something that kind of like set us up to plan this migration out a little bit better. On that topic, so I think it comes as a surprise to people when I talk about the fact that we invest a lot of time in upskilling external consultants. During this summer, as I mentioned, we relied on these like people for a lot of the transformation work that we do, and they were the ones that were going to need to do the work in dbt as well. None of them had ever seen dbt before, or at least didn't to my knowledge, and so we were starting from scratch teaching them the frameworks of dbt and how version control works and all of this stuff. So for us, dbt Cloud was a really good tool for this, because you kind of like see the DAG be built as you're working in dev. You skip a lot of the teaching people how CL command lines work, teaching people how to manage Python dependencies. And so for us, that was a really helpful sort of starting point to scale kind of quickly with a lot of people that had to learn a lot. You can see in this the sort of first bout of potential energy build. The light blue line is that new committers, people that are starting to make commits to the project. And it doesn't exactly align with open PRs and closed PRs. These are people working on these branches for literally months, right? And that, I think, expresses kind of like this build of potential energy as then it gets converted in October. This was an example where, yes, that was the start of season, so we had to get it done. And at the end, there were probably a lot of shortcuts taken. But one thing I want to draw attention to is the one-on-one sessions in September, August area. Over the summer, I was trying to set up this culture of like async, work through the PR review, like you put up your PR, I'll comment on it, leave a ton of comments and explain things. And that would sort of like move us at like one bit of improvement at a time without really being able to explain to someone like where this was ultimately going. I realized at a certain point that it just took myself and our other full-time analytics engineer just getting into these like paired programming sessions to understand like what parts are you getting and what parts are you not seeing. To sort of do something that doesn't scale, it wouldn't have made sense for us to sit with each one of these things. But that would create these sort of like people who had bought in, got it, get their aha moment, and then we have these sort of deputies to kind of expand the practice of analytics engineering. It sounds like it's a religion. So that was a big win for us and a big reason why we were able to scale up and get things done towards the end of the summer for us. The results here, 80% of reporting stood up by the start of the season. The rest, I think, was either deprioritized or was coming soon. I really was proud of the fact that there were 0 prod run failures in SQL, like due to SQL errors. I think if you have a good CI process, it should be impossible to introduce a SQL bug into your code. At the same time, like data quality issues would still happen, and those are great to catch. But building out that CI meant that like there weren't any of these like places where someone changes something upstream and it breaks something downstream. Like all of that would be caught in CI. And then pipeline failures caught in minutes and hours instead of days, and that was a lot of time back for people. So reflections and learning from this time, I would say one of the things was, we started with that teaching people how to do that migration trick, that sort of visualize what was needed to get done. It is not the way that you actually like would do DBT work. It took a while to sort of unlearn that or unteach that. And I would say just, if you're trying to teach a lot of people, think about like where they're at and what you're teaching them at each stage, and try to constantly repeat where we're going with this, what's the final vision, so that people kind of know when they're like at an intermediate step on purpose. Picking spots to let people fail, there was a lot of scaling pressure, right? Like as this got so big and I and one other person were the primary reviewers, it got to a point where it was just unrealistic for us to fine-tooth comb like every PR that was put up. So some of the places of like skipping the, getting too granular was a good call, because it was, letting someone like learn for themselves when a data model choice wasn't ideal, and maybe they had to deal with it in a couple weeks when it bit them. But that being said, there are places where you don't want to mess this up. We had one situation where we hadn't put all the right guardrails yet on CI. We were just like, I'm sure it'll be fine. And someone somehow figured out a way to kick off a CI job that ran for 48 hours before it was canceled. This was a very expensive mistake, but in the grand scheme of things, it was like one loud mistake that we obviously fixed as soon as possible. But again, think about where you can let people fail and there's not a big deal and they can learn and earn those scars, versus where it's going to like really bite everyone. And then I think similar, and I'll talk about this again a little bit in a bit, but stakeholder communications, talking about slowing down to speed up, and making sure that like stakeholders understand where we're going with this, so that they don't feel like we're just introducing more friction into the process. So now that we've scaled, the whole point was to make sure that we kept that velocity. If it was just like this one big spike of input, but we didn't have anything from there, maybe the system wasn't really working as it was supposed to. So the goal here is to sort of try and express the leverage that the system had created. I'm just going to take a quick drink of water. So in those first 2 to 3 months to the season starting, a lot of this was about like basically acknowledging the things we had cut corners on, but also the things we had put a lot of hard time into to like refactor and make better, and seeing the difference between the places where we had really put some time in to like make the system work a little bit better, the DAG make a little more sense, how quickly we could expand on what we had done before. I think stakeholders at this time were very shocked at those things that took a really long time to build over the summer, and they would ask for an additional column or like a slight edit. And those things with a good DBT DAG should take you an hour, max, end to end. And for them to see that like that speed existed got us a lot of buy-in for when we said like, we need to refactor this other thing, because we'll be able to then be as nimble as we are with XYZ model. One of the things that we definitely cut a corner on was our customer entitlement table. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this XKCD visual for a lot of different things. For us, this was like the NBA data platform in a nutshell. It was like all this stuff built on this one like subscription analytics base table. It was a janky like thousands line long query that was very confusing. I'm sure there were like hanging CTs that didn't actually do anything anymore. Super hard to debug. This was the thing I was talking about when I said about the cave diving expeditions early on. It was also causing us headaches all the time. And so in that first 2 to 3 months, like it would have been easy to say we need to just like stop using this, rip it down, and start over. But that would have been downtime for a lot of subscription like league pass reporting at the start of the season, which was not really an option. So with DBT, the fact that we could refactor these things in bits and like find those bottlenecks and fix them bit by bit made a big difference. On On the topic of refactoring, you know this phrase, like, inside you there are two wolves? Inside me, there were these two beavers. I, as the sort of admin of the whole project and an engineer myself, like, constantly wished I could stop time and like just spend like 20 hours making something closer to like what would be perfect. Realistically, you can't stop time, right? Everything keeps going, and you're going to have to keep thinking about refactors as like slices, little bits that you're going to take off, and not try and like restructure the whole system. It's never going to happen. And so yeah, that was sort of a constant battle with myself at that point. More memes here. Pedram tweeted this out a few months ago. The experience of trying to optimize or enhance a CI/CD pipeline. A shout out to our analytics engineer who's here, Caleb, who the number of times I would hear him say like, the CI job like isn't quite right. There's a few things that we have to do manually almost every single time, and we're running into it now like every single day. I think I can fix that. And then 3 weeks later, he's still banging his head against the wall trying to figure out like how to make it actually work. That being said, these like investments in the DevOps process and in acknowledging it and stepping in to fix it at the right time did work. These were like sort of those things that gave us the leverage to have this sort of completely new sort of velocity standard, right? Once we scaled up and we realized we wanted to kind of keep that up, anytime that would slow down because of complicated CI jobs, we would make one of those sort of improvements that were probably in like a long list of to-dos in the first place to keep that growth going. One of my goals for 2024, my KPIs, was number of PRs opened and closed without my involvement at all. I thought that would be a good like expression of the leverage. For a while, especially over the summer, it was easy to feel like if I don't touch it and sort of teach someone the way, then it's not going to get done quite the right way. And this was like a goal to like let go a little bit, but also just see if the system if the system works, if the people we've put all this time into to teach why we're doing this, if they can just get it done on their own. And we saw the results. It was really exciting. I would also call out, we hit this like 35 cap, it looks like. That was more of a function of the fact that was our contract limit, and so we're about to expand into a new set of seats. So we kind of changed our focus from evangelization and growth at that point to just making sure we got the most efficiency out of the people that were using seats. But hopefully you'll see another uptick from here. We also achieved one of the, let's see what time it is, one of the biggest like wins in consolidating logic and bringing departments together with our viewership data. I mentioned the fact live game stream starts and this like unlucky soul earlier. Caleb again had to basically take that top orange box and kind of refactor it and expand it upstream. This was like a couple months of basically getting content analytics and product analytics and data strategy and data engineering all together to agree on the way we defined a lot of our viewership metrics and classifications of viewership activity. But the result was this huge explosion in all these things we could do and get right in every dashboard. And it was the first time you'd see that like a content analytics dashboard and a product analytics dashboard and another one were all saying the same thing about how many people were watching stories, watched that game last night, et cetera. It was a huge win and something really only possible with dbt, and this like constant investment in collaboration practices that we had gone into before that. This is again just a reminder of what it looked like before. So results from this time, the consistency of reporting and uptime, all of these little snippet refactors meant that we were keeping all these things on when other times people had been ripping them down and saying, we're not putting that up again until we fixed it. And the consistency of the metrics being the same. Again, the stakeholders orienting around the dbt workflow was one of the coolest ones. Like I said, we had this experience of people seeing how much faster we could work once we were in this kind of like built into this tool the right way. And so stakeholders started to like make their tickets with a lot more intent, a lot more writing, and make like separate tickets for the DBT model that they, like the edits to the DBT model versus like what needed to happen in the BI layer. Like they were starting to really understand this part of the process, and that was a huge win for us. We also expanded into multiple projects, not really in a mesh standpoint. These were like separate concepts, but we'll more on that in a second. My reflections and learning, like I said, just like try and take a step back and let the system work at a certain point. You will get these sort of pieces of feedback, good and bad, of like, oh, that thing was only working because I was propping it up with a lot of effort, but that is working really well. And then you can kind of, reassess where you need to improve things. The last one I would just want to call out is don't forget to show off. I mentioned early on, I think that the data engineering team doesn't use DBT, which I think is a unique setup that we have where we focus so much more on this like analyst persona. But I realized we hadn't shown them like our CI/CD or development experience in a really long time. And a couple weeks ago, we had just like this hour meeting where Caleb and I just like jumped in a call with them and like we walked them through the experience, and they were super impressed. I think they were still thinking of like the sandbox DB rat's nest and the people that had made that and the situation that had made that, and we had really like cleaned that up and made a really great system. So impressed that there's been these sort of secret gold layer tables that we've built in the sandbox DB layer that now we're talking about creating like a shared code base to build together. And I think that's a huge win in the like opportunity for collaboration. So yeah, just don't forget to like, even if it's back-end DevOps, it's still amazing stuff, and it's great to like remind people that you're building this leverage and you're building a better system. What's next? I think Mesh, as I mentioned with the new project with data engineering, that's really exciting for us to dig into now. The semantic layer, we're certainly not ready for that for the last like year or two, but now I think we're in a place where it is something that we want to explore this next year. I'm really excited about the auto exposures in Tableau. I think that's going to make a huge difference. I love things in DBT that like work without like relying on everyone's personal self-discipline, and exposures before were like, if you write it, it's there, but otherwise like it's not, and then it's meaningless in the end. So that's really exciting. And yeah, we're just excited to like find those to-dos in the code base and clean them all up. Yeah, any questions, or people can come up to me. I think we're at time, so yeah.